I just want to say this before we jump into our larger subject, because I
Okay.
said this to people, but I'm not sure if I said this to you. So Edward was part of the theater company for a while, Lizard Theater. He would join us for Jay Parker and myself. He would do improv shows. He would do plays with us off and on. And I'm about to say something that's not a praise to me. I was in this thing called American Improv, a show that we did that we created, and it riffed on American Idol. And you had the Simon character, and you had several people as judges, and then you had improv actors just getting up and doing it. So I see improv all the time. So I do comedy still, and I see improv and things like that. When you and Sunny, and I want to say Katie, or I think that was her name. So we had revolving actors come in and out, and we had done it many, many times. So we had it like a well-oiled machine. So I was just the host. So I'm not praising myself when I say this. I don't want people to think, oh, he's talking about. I was just the host, and I was mostly just watching it. It was maybe the best improv I had ever seen. It was you, Sunny, Katie, and Jay, and it was magic. I mean, I've never seen better improv. I mean, maybe at the level of a Groundlings and others. It was just so good.
Oh, thank you.
Welcome, everybody, to the show. Today we have special guest, first-time guest. I can't believe he's never been on before. We are talking to Edward Portillo. Edward, thank you for joining us.
Great to see you. Great to see everybody. Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
Now, Edward, we talked to you about a year ago on your particular podcast, but talk about what you do. What do you do for a living? What's your title? And it'll make more sense.
Yeah, so I work for a nonprofit called the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and they're affiliate in Orange County. They are the largest grassroots organization that supports families, individuals, and parents that are affected by mental illness. And I'm the program manager there. So I'm also the host of their podcast called It's Okay to Feel. Excellent.
So you delve into this idea of mental health. Jacob and I were in a Zoom discussion with you a year ago about this issue and how it impacts students. And it's funny because I remember at one point I gave my input on how to support students with mental health issues. One of them is good teaching, which sounds very superficial. Hey, you're dealing with better things, but sometimes students need that context. That's my, that content. I mean, and that's my contribution. And there are other things that we talked about, but today is a little different. I thought we would delve into this area of spiritual mentors and teachers. So we have never done that before. Now, this is a teaching podcast, but a lot of our students and teachers have been influenced by spiritual mentors. And of course, I mean rabbis, priests, pastors. Now, we know each other from a church that we attended, and we had a pastor, and we actually had multiple pastors eventually. And so I'm sure you have stories, Edward. I'm sure Jacob has stories, and I know I do. So I guess before we jump into it, I want to talk about a discussion you had on a recent podcast with Dr. Esther Park. I got her name correct, right?
Yes, from Oak Health Foundation. Yeah.
Okay. What foundation again? Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
It's called the Oak Health Foundation. They're in Irvine.
Okay.
California, yeah.
So I want you to talk about that, maybe your own ideas about that discussion, but I do want to mention, she said several things, but one of the key things she talked about is this idea. I could tell she was brought up in the Christian church like we do. And there are some real examples of dangers within that context. And one of the dangers, at one point, she mentions this idea of hero worship. And isn't that true? And I felt that at least my experience is that with the church we attended, her example, by the way, before I get into my thing, her example was excellent. At one point, she mentioned one example of hero worship, and you could think about, maybe we think too highly of pastors. You can never question them, perhaps. But she, by way of example, she mentioned that she was at a meeting, maybe a prayer meeting, and somebody asked her to lay her hands on them and they'll get healed. And then she said, I'm not going to lay my hands. You lay your own hands on that, you know, member of the Bible study, because it's not about me. You have the same power. And I thought, isn't this true? Isn't it true that Jesus says you will do these things too? You will do great things. And I really liked her example. I have my own examples. I don't want to talk too much, but what's your take on that, Edward, or anything else from that interview or that discussion you had with Dr. Esther?
Yeah. Yeah. You know, part of the discussion when I initially talked to her, because she actually has a group that she does weekly that studies scripture, but also in the mental health lens. So she'll talk about a specific story, then kind of talk about a specific disorder, and it's great because she has the clinical background. And so I felt like it is geared towards individuals that have been hurt by the church. And so I knew that she understood what I wanted to talk about. And what I understood as I grew up, because we grew up in a church that was almost the preeminent church that was the big show, you know, the big lights, the big, you know, Ruben and I would perform often, like, you know, in front of, you know, at least 2,000 people maybe a day for 3 services. And you know, if there wasn't an improv show or a comedy show skit, there was a video, or there was a dance, or there was, you know, some sort of, you know, great light show with the worship and everything. And it became this idea of a package. And you know, what I noticed as I was growing up is that it was less about, you know, what you think of. Well, I don't even know, because I this is all I knew. But I really didn't understand discipleship. You know, I didn't really understand mentoring. You know, I didn't really understand 100% of what that looked like, because it was really about how dynamic the pastor was. You know, how dynamic the speaking was. And there were some good things. I mean, I think I learned a lot from that specific pastor. But I think the idea of hero worship came out of this thought of my experience growing up, of seeing that you could turn your whole, you know, agency into this idea of, well, that person must know more than I do because that person speaks so well. That person is just this example of, you know, they're closer to God than I am. So maybe I really do need to listen to whatever that person says. And so you become more susceptible to being, being manipulated. And so that was the big idea behind hero worship.
Yeah, very good. Did this idea resonate with you too, Jacob, or was there something else within that discussion that you wanted to bring up?
Well, you know, the church that we all went to, there were actually a couple pastors, as you mentioned, Ruben. There's actually several, but I know at a younger age, I started going there when I was 10. So I was, at that age, you're impressionable, aren't you? And so I think it was just natural to look up to people. And as I got older, I think it became more clear, and maybe that's one reason why I left, when there was a shift in leadership there too. But I could see how people were not even speaking about God so much anymore, but they're speaking about that person.
Mm-hmm.
And I go, wow, I mean, geez, I mean, where does God come into all this? And when you're sharing about discipleship and all that, I don't think that was a center anymore. It was more of a center like, hey, this person, how many books, and and it's like, well, is that really, is that where it's at? It's like you said, I think you mentioned the word package. And so,
right.
You get lost in that, and you get lost in, and you could get lost in that whole program. Like, and that's how it felt, like a program. And so you get a little disillusioned. I think some people would walk away from all that and say, but I really felt I had a relationship with God. So I'm like, I need to go somewhere where I feel comfortable, where it's not a package. And, you got to find a place like that. And maybe you have to go to a couple places, because I think it's not just a septic to our experience. I think that it's there in other places, and you'll see it and you go, oh my God, this is the same as my previous church. And you got to find it, and you have to be patient. And I really believe you need to find a family where you get to grow and learn from, and go through life, live life with, right? And so, but no, right. I hear you. It definitely was for a young man, or a young boy. It just became so big. And as an adult, I'm glad I kind of understood it.
To define
And,
terms,
and
just to define terms a bit, because both of you mentioned the word discipleship. So for those viewers who aren't sure what that means, it essentially means teaching and mentoring, which is the theme of our channel, is that you are called, if you are, a believer, Christian, you're called to disciple when you're mature enough to teach others. But I think what Edward and Jacob are saying, it got lost a little bit in maybe the show and maybe the power, the heroism of the pastor. And I like what you said in the video, the discussion that we're at right now, even the performances, the dances, so you mentioned performances. I was involved in the drama, so were you. And I felt like when I did it early on, it was meant to teach, disciple,
right.
for the greater good, or for the Lord, as opposed to later that became in and of itself the message is how great are we? How great is this dance show and the light show? So,
Right.
what would you add? What were you going to say, Edward?
I was just going to add to what Jacob said. You said you were there when you were 10, and I was there when I was in basically preschool till 2006, which is I graduated college. So a year after I graduated college. So basically my whole life was at this particular church. And that's why I feel like coming out of it, I have so much that I really think it's important to talk about, because once you're out of a situation like that, you kind of realize that, there's a much deeper relationship that you can have with God, and I think that's the loss of hero worship, is that, like you're saying, Ruben, is that you lose that connection because and what Jacob said, you're talking more about the sensation than you are of the spirit,
And I think there's some protocols to strong leadership that should be in place, or steps that should be there. I think pastors, it all starts with the leader, doesn't it? The pastor has to say, look, I'm not infallible. It's God's word might be perfect, but I'm not. So you can challenge me. And to Brother Tom Wolf's credit, who was the pastor when Jacob and my other brother Chris and I started going to that church, I was 8. He often would go to our high schoolers when I was in high school, and he would say, when are you ready for a question and answer time? He asked us to challenge him. So I was ready. I wrote out questions. I was ready to burn him, to bring him down, to catch him, to contradict him. And he took it. And we had several of those question and answer times. Doesn't that speak highly of him?
Yeah, and it speaks that I understand now why you got along with my brother so well. Same way, but yeah, that speaks really well of the willingness to be challenged. And at a certain point, the pastor that we're talking about that took over, there was opportunity to do that, but slowly but surely it became less and less of access to that particular person, because it was like, now you had to go through this person. Now they have an assistant. Now they have 2 assistants. And now they have, this pastor now that's in charge of this part, and he doesn't have to take the shepherding part. He's just the speaker. So that's all you have to kind of worry about. So that's also something to be concerned about. If you're going to a church that has multiple layers for you to actually get to talk to the pastor, he's just a pastor. At the end of the day, he's the same, like we just said earlier, he's the same person that has the same ability to connect with God. If you're in a Protestant church, or even a Catholic church, that's the idea, is that you have this intimate connection yourself, and that's what you need to develop, versus using it all and giving it all to every Sunday to a dynamic speaker.
I'm just trying to think, Ed, like, how does one, it's a tough one. How does one not become, and I'm not trying to badmouth anybody, be neurotic, because I feel like, or narcissism, you have this, you get to a place where there's a lot of people attending. There's a lot of people telling you how great you are and how wonderful you are. And where do you stop and say, wait a minute, let's focus over here. on God, not on me. And I know that's the right thing to do, but then I think, well, how does this happen? Because not just in the church, but in other institutions as well, where people, you can even say that about presidents. I think every president has that narcissism, right? And so that being said, how does that, how does one begin not to be that way? Because I just think that, I think in the beginning, these people really had well intentions, and something got away. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is who you're bringing along along yourself. I don't know if you heard there's a really great series on done by Christianity Today of the rise and fall of Mars Hill and the rise this pastor Mark Driscoll that was in Seattle. And if you listen to the podcast episodes, it gets to a point where he didn't have anybody that was willing to be mentoring him or pouring into him, and so he would talk to people and he'd say, your church isn't big enough for me to even talk to you, so why are you even talking? I'm not going to listen to anything like that. And then turns out he ends up getting kicked out of his church because of that type of attitude. So I think a lot of it is who you bring into your life, who's challenging you. I mean, even that Brother Tom, there was a saying that Brother Tom used to say, is like, what you hum is what you become, or something about, tell me who your friends are and I'll see where that's what you really care about. So another saying like that. So
yeah,
it's really about those images of, and those things that you bring into your life that matter to your foundation of how you're going to, run things.
Yeah, so really it's about, like everything else, you need accountability. You need strong leadership. These are themes that we talk about as teachers. We talk about the very importance of having a strong principal, but also people around them, leadership teams, and you're saying the same thing. Of course, it's true. I would also something else that Esther Park mentioned, and I just thought it was really interesting. It has bothered me for years when I went to the church. I'm not picking on any church, actually. I think this happens sometimes. The hyper spirituality, the over spirituality of things. I have this earache, the devil's attacking me. I think that's what her example that she gave. But I remember there was just this movement for a while where the devil was in everything. I'm being attacked. And first of all, I don't know how biblical that is, where Christians are being attacked by the devil every 5 seconds. Leaving that aside, it feels like sometimes you need to answer for your own decisions. Take the consequences. Don't always blame the devil. What do you think about that, Edward?
Yeah, I think the idea of hyper spiritualization is something big in and you're right, it's not just in the church that we grew up in. I grew up in also my family has a Pentecostal background, and so in the Pentecostal background, that kind of thinking is very hyper spiritual, where you have to speak in tongues. My grandmother would say, I would talk about, I like this girl, I'm talking, has she speaking, does she speak in tongues? Does she speak in tongues? It was like this idea of like, that's the true connection to God, when you're able to speak in the tongues of angels. I mean, that just so that we can talk to the readers, when you say speak in tongues, it means that there's a moment if you read in Acts where the Spirit came down and people started speaking in different languages, and they think that that's like the spirit of the language of the angels is when you speak in tongues. And so yeah, I think there's an issue where, again, you're losing your human agency. You're giving away your ability to critically think. You're giving because you're constantly putting this, like, I don't know where you get this from, like, idea of what God is, this like miser that's there. It's like, don't do that. Okay, get it back. Okay, pray about, did you do this? You're almost like bringing in your whatever you grew up with and whatever was going on in your trauma maybe, and interpreting that as your vision of how God is. And a lot of that, again, is like, if you don't have anybody pouring into your life, if you're not going to a church that's providing any of that type of like discussion or anything like that, you can get to a place where you just get to this you're almost scared to do certain things, because you're right, it could be attack, it could be whatever it could be, and it's you got to discern really what is those true moments where you have to be concerned and watchful and prayerful, but also know that, where does your own bias come in? That's kind of interpreting things.
Very good. What about you, Jacob? Anything else about the chat with Dr. Esther Park? Maybe
No,
we'll
I
link
do
it.
want to. Yeah, I'm gonna say hopefully we could put a link, right, Ruben, to Esther Park's discussion with Ed. But yeah, I hear you, Ed, regarding, in a way, I think we have to be people. We get stuck in that type of language as well, and not only the behavior but the language, because we're also in the world where we meet other people. Like Ruben and I are teachers, and even yourself, you're out there in the world and meeting people. And I think that we have to be accessible, right? And not only that, our language has to be a language where it's understood, and it's not all like, well, the gods and the devil's doing this. I mean, people get kind of like, what is this person talking about?
Yeah.
And I think we have to be sensitive to that, and to be in our positions and leadership and so forth, to be people to even that people will feel free to come to us, and say, hey, hey, can I talk? And I've had people come up to me and say, oh, can I talk to you about this thing that's happening? And I go, wow. And I never wanted to be that type of person where it's saying, well, this is what God's. They already know that they already know that. I don't have to be throwing in their face and saying, hey, and start speaking a different little language. And you know what I'm talking about. Sometimes I hear discussions like, oh, I know this person's a Christian just by the way they're talking, And but I think we have to be that. I mean, I think that as being believers, and we are here in the Christian church, and there's of course other churches that have that as well. But for us, we want to be people that are accessible, and I think. Do you feel that same way, Edward, or am I just
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
accessible. Yeah, and again, like you got to be in a place that a place of humility. Yeah, and that's very important in order to people can feel comfortable. Exactly. Talk to you.
I do want to
Yeah.
mention for those viewers who don't consider themselves spiritual, I will say that just because you go to church, it doesn't mean you have to put your brain away, put it on hold or something. I want to mention a church member that had a big influence on me, and his name was Craig Wright. So Craig Wright, when he'd hear something, he would challenge it. When I talked to him, he would challenge me. I would say stuff like this, some of these cliches that we've been talking about. Oh, I really feel like I'm being attacked. This word attacked. I might have said something like that to him. And he says, what do you mean? Well, how so? Are you sure you could defend that in the Bible? Because I don't read that. And he would challenge me. I remember one time I said, hey, Craig, what's new? I'll never forget this. So if people who wonder why I am the way I am, and I'll question things when people say something silly, I don't like cliches, blame Craig Wright. I said, I was maybe 20, 21 at the time. I said, hey, Craig, what's new? And he says, what's new? What does that mean? That's a meaningless statement. Think about what you say, Ruben. And boy, did I after that. Boy, did I think about what I said, especially when I'm talking to him. But he helped shape my thinking, and being
Right.
with how I spoke. And boy, did he challenge the pastor, both of them. And they weren't maybe the biggest, well, I don't want to speak for them, but not everybody was a fan of Craig Wright, but I was, because I like people who use their brain like that and didn't just take everything that was coming in, but challenged it. So,
but doesn't that go with what we're talking about before regarding mentorship? Like when I mentioned that, or you actually, Ed, you said that, what, they need to have, these pastors need to have somebody speaking to them. And we need that. I mean, we need a mentor. We need spiritual mentors in our life, even though we're in our 40s, 50s, or at least, you guys are in your 50s. No, I'm Ed's in his 40s. But no, that being said, but in all seriousness, we need somebody, right? I mean, and I have a Bible study that I go to, Ed, and there's a man who's in his mid to late 70s now. Man, he speaks into my life all the time. He encourages me. The things that Ruben was sharing about Craig Wright, he's like my Craig Wright. He's challenging me. He's telling me to go back to the scriptures, and he's prays with me. And I think we need those people for us not to get off track. Do you have that a person like that in your life, Ed?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great kind of way of kind of bringing back our original church that we're talking about, because it wasn't all bad. It wasn't all a bad experience, because the people that were the youth pastors at the time, I even Ruben, I wasn't at during Ruben's time, but Ruben kind of poured into my brother's life during the time that he was in high school. And Ruben was a volunteer at the youth group. And then when I started going into the youth group, the guy who now is the head of the creative arts, and he's still there. He was my junior high pastor, and he was the first person that allowed me to be on stage. You know, he's the first person that said, you know, I did some sort of, you know, poem that I wrote about O.J. Simpson and what was going on in the time. And then, you know, Jaime Puente was another guy who was my youth pastor after that during junior high and high school. And he went one time he just called me and was like, hey, there's this audition to be on the radio. Do you want to be on the radio? We'll pick you up. And so I went with him the whole day, and that stays with me forever. That he thought of me. You know, he wanted to hang out with me and spend time with me and invest in something that I was interested in. You know, like being on the radio and, you know, kind of the performance background that I had. So yeah, there was a lot of people that, you know, early on that were, to this day, I'm still friends with. I mean, even you guys, you know, knowing you and getting to know you for such a long time goes to this idea of people that have poured into your life and mentored you in a way. So yeah, for sure. And that's really, even this Craig, right? All these people that we're talking about came from that church. So there is a lot of great things that happened, but, you know, overall, there's a lot of other things that I think, you know, once you step away, that you can look back and go, wow, that wasn't the best.
Absolutely. And I think I became a youth leader because of the time invested in my own life too. I had Bruce and Clara Welch, I know Jacob did too.
Yeah, for sure.
We had several, Eddie Marshall and several
Holly
more.
Hair, yeah.
Any last words about this topic? Spiritual mentors, helpful, harmful? Any last things to say about this that we might have missed?
Well, can I just say something? I think that it's just important to have these type of conversations. I think just to be real regarding our past and not to live in the past, because I share that with people in my life all the time. I go, we need to move forward, and I think you're doing that. And even by talking about it, you're saying, hey, now I know what to look for, but also you're trying to help other people who are dealing with these issues so they can move forward with their lives, not to be stuck in the past and say, oh, this terrible church. I know people who walk away from God because they had a bad experience with a pastor or a youth worker or someone like that. And I think that's so sad. And the reality is that we need to have these discussions, these conversations, and so we can move on with our lives and be able to help others and be able to mentor others, because this is what it's about. I mean, we're at an age where we are becoming mentors, even though we have still, thank God, we still have people we look up to and we talk to, like you mentioned, some of these people who were in our lives when we were youth. We still see them and talk to them. But yeah, I mean, I think at this stage in our lives, we got to be that to somebody as well.
All right. Edward, any last word?
Yeah, I mean, just to sum up things, I mean, you know, when I first brought this topic up to my CEO at the nonprofit, she was really like apprehensive, and I had to write up a detailed, you know, what am I going to talk about? What is the specific things that we're going to touch on? Because we're not going to come down on any religion. We're not going to come down on any particular, you know, belief system or anything like that. We're just trying to show what are the unhealthy things to look at in order for you to have a better outcome in your mental health, because the spiritual aspect affects so much of your you know, being and identity. And so this topic is, I'm so happy to be able to continue to talk about it and giving us a spot with two people that I know and are believers as well, so we can talk about even more specific things than I can in you know, the nonprofit space that I work in. So yeah, I appreciate what you said, Jacob, because I think that's true. I'm not trying to necessarily live in the past, but I think to be able to point out certain things to help others is always the goal.
Oh yeah. No, and I do appreciate the work you do, because I know the people who come onto your discussions, your podcast, or I guess it's a podcast, right? It's a discussion.
There's a forum and a podcast, so we do both. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's all about helping others and with their mental health right now, not only in education but in every field. There's people who are really hurting and who really are trying to figure out. I mean, I was just talking to somebody yesterday and said, man, the field of psychology is blowing up because there's so many people who need to talk to. I mean, everybody you talk to has a therapist, and I always say, I teach psychology actually. I always say to my kids, hey, there's nothing wrong with that. We should talk about it so we can move ahead, you know. And so, I thank you for doing your work that you do, because it's really, I believe it's really helping a lot of people. So thank you, Edward.
Thank you.
Yes, and thank you, Edward, for joining us and on our Pod and Deliver podcast, working through mental health issues, spiritual issues. We really appreciate it, Edward.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
And we'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.
All right. See ya.
Edward.
All right.